It's interesting how easy it is to get captured by some types of historical stories. Now, clearly, this is a boat I find myself in often by the sheer nature of the content I make for this channel. Today's topic is an engine, and one that has such unique backstory, approach, and future, yes, I said future, that I just had to share it. A bold experiment cut down by a rulemaker's pen, which was then hurried into service, failed in ignominy. This hairy-chested beast of an experimental engine, once thought lost to time, is actually being brought back to life with modern technology. And by the time we're done here, I'm going to tell you by who, how, and where to follow that process. But first, we need to dive into the short and fascinating history of the Ford Calliope V8 and the Le Mans engine that never was. Ford's total performance era was unprecedented for its time, unmatched until today, and will never be replicated again. It was an approach to racing as a condition of war. Global in its scope, relentless in its pursuit, and singular in its goals, the whole program was designed not to just place Ford cars in every form of racing known to man, it was to place them there to win, and win big. Stock cars, drag racing, endurance racing, rally racing, hill climbs, Indianapolis, Formula One. The list doesn't stop. The Blue Oval was never mightier nor more adventurous on the world's race courses as it was during total performance. Of course, the most celebrated of these efforts, which has been memorialized on stage and screen, is the company's full-court press to beat Ferrari at the 24 Hours of Le Mans. This was, of course, and is the world's marquee sports car racing event, and I certainly don't need to retell the story here about how Henry Ford II wrote a blank check to a congregation of the world's best automotive engineers to build the world's best endurance sports racing car, and by God, they did it. Well, not without its missteps, bumps, and challenges, the GT40 effort paid off in 1966 with the iconic victory that the company scored. They did it again in 1967, this despite Ferrari and their parent company Fiat also piling money into a myriad of crash developmental programs to fight Ford to the doom in France. That season, the Ferrari team slapped the GT40 squad all over the place at the 24 Hours of Daytona, forcing Ford back into their proverbial engineering labs to improve the stuff that they had for the looming challenge ahead. As things turned out, the big V12 Ferraris would not have anything for the anvil-like reliability and thumping power of the 427 FE Ford engines in the GT40s for a second year in a row. But as I mentioned, this was war. And in war, you don't simply try to predict your opponent's next move, you try to look 2 moves ahead, and that's exactly what Ford engineers had already started doing in 1967. Improving the chassis, aerodynamics, and refinement of the GT40 among other elements for the 1967 seasons before Le Mans, they had also decided to refine the machine's power. The 427 and the effectively brand new version of the car was good, but it was at the end of its engineering rope, or so it was believed. The replacement? No, it wasn't going to be a 428 Cobra jet, it was going to be something clean sheet. An engine weaponized from the first pen stroke of its creation to make more power than anyone else, be more reliable than anything else, and of course, keep the GT40 streak of global supremacy not just at Le Mans intact, but everywhere else as well. Taking years of knowledge in building small and big block engines in competition, as well as understanding the engines their rivals were using, unleashed engineers came up with a piece using no factory parts and a layout no Ford engine had ever used before, and it was internally called the Calliope. Yes, it was named after a steam-powered musical instrument developed in the 1800s, and there was a good reason for that, and I'll explain it to you in just a moment. Ford engineers wanted an engine that would be reliable, producing more than 600 horsepower, 650 being more than ideal, and could be packaged into the GT40J car that had been developed in the 1967 timeframe. To achieve these goals, they took a creative and kind of bizarre route. This engine has 2 camshafts. Not weird. They were stacked in the center of the block. Weird. This engine was using individual runner fuel injection. Not weird. The runners were cast into the cylinder head. Weird. It was to be a multi-valve per cylinder engine. Not weird. There were 3 valves per cylinder. For 1967, weird. The engine used copper rings around the cylinders to seal them. Not weird. But this was the only sealing as there were no head gaskets. Weird. And the list can go on. The list will go on. but we need to take a second and really look at the elements of what made this engine, the Calliope, so unique. Yes, we're talking 427 cubic inches of V8 with 3 valves per cylinder, a dry deck, meaning water didn't pass freely between the block and the heads, integral cast fuel-injected runners into the intake manifold, hence the Calliope name, 2 camshafts stacked up in the center of the block, and the whole thing was made of aluminum. What in the world were these guys thinking? You know, if there's one thing that this engine shares with what were to be the new 385 series Ford big block set to debut in 1968, it was the bore spacing of 4.9 inches. Bore spacing, of course, refers to the distance from the center of one cylinder bore to the center of the next. Other than the bore spacing, of course, and that is just a physical measurement, not another blessed thing on this power plant has anything to do with the 385 series big block. Okay, so we start with a cast aluminum block with the mentioned 4.9 inches of bore spacing. Did the engineers decide to use the 4.23-inch bore and 3.7-inch stroke to make a 427 as they did in the FE engines? No, they did not. Instead, the Calliope would have a larger 4.34-inch bore and a shorter 3.6-inch stroke. The block used steel cylinder liners. The crankshaft had 3-inch main journals, 2.5-inch rod journals. The oiling system was dry sump, which also doubled as its own vacuum pump because it used a scavenge pump capable of moving 50 gallons per minute, which was run with a roller chain off the front of the crank, and it was paired with a shaft-driven pressure pump that could move 20 gallons of oil per minute. This entire setup, the way it was designed, would help create negative pan pressure at the bottom of the engine. Now, for packaging reasons and to keep the overall length down, 2 short water pumps were used on the front of the engine rather than one large pump. The 2 smaller pumps kept the overall length down, and it is kind of a weird-seeming throwback to the flathead days to see those 2 water pumps on the front of the block. The cylinder heads were pretty amazing pieces for their day and even really into today's world. The cast of aluminum, they had short individual stack-style runners actually cast into the heads. This meant no intake manifold was needed, and it optimized the runner design to the intake valve. The head used a 1.665-inch intake valve, 2 of them per cylinder, and a single 1.809-inch exhaust valve. The concept here, of course, is the fact that the cooler, denser air coming in from the atmosphere could more easily cram itself into a cylinder through 2 smaller valves, creating a larger overall area rather than a single large valve. The valves were canted, and the combustion chamber was a pent roof design, much like the modern Gen 3 Hemi. You heard me. I said what I said. And there was a centrally located spark plug in each cylinder. Now, different fuel injection companies have been named on this engine. They tried Hilborn, they used Lucas, and there was even a third named company called the Taclomet Jackson fuel injection unit that was mentioned over the course of time, although I've never seen photos of that on the car. The bottom line is that this was going to be a mechanical, low-pressure, fuel-injected fed engine. You pick your brand. Of course, the stars of this show are the camshafts. Stacked vertically in the block, it's among the weirder things you'll ever see. The camshaft for the intake valve is the lower one, sitting 6 inches above the center line of the crank. The push rods run parallel to the cylinder bores in this layout, and a set of long push rods handles moving conventional shaft-mounted rocker arms which actuated the valves. Now, 4.5 inches above the center line of the intake camshaft lives the exhaust camshaft. The push rods for this sucker are effectively horizontal to the exhaust rockers, and long, large tube push rods are moving the exhaust rockers on that horizontal path. Both of the camshafts are driven by sprocket and timing chain method. In all of my poking, prodding, and digging around, I could not locate the cam specs for the exhaust or intake sticks, but I know they're out there somewhere, and certainly somebody who watches this may actually have access to them. One of the other interesting things I mentioned about this engine is the fact it didn't use traditional head gaskets. Instead, copper receiver rings in the block sealed the combustion chambers to the heads. The head studs also had copper receiver rings around them that were picked up by the head and when torqued down, sealed them. This was possible because the deck of the engine was solid, as were the heads, kind of. Basically, water was pumped through the engine and then exited toward the back of the engine, passing through a water line and entering the cylinder head through a fitting in the rear. It would then flow from the back of the head to the front, to the water pumps, and the circulation would begin again. Published data and claims that Ford made set the engine with an output of some 630 horsepower at 6,400 RPM. Obviously, the way this engine was set up, it was designed to rev, so higher RPM would have definitely given a more robust horsepower figure, but they chose 6,400 for reasons known to them, likely to keep the competition at bay. The whole beastly thing weighed 577 pounds. Now, That may strike you as heavy, but it's still about 80 pounds lighter than the iron FE engines that were in the GT40s, so it was a step in the right direction. So here's where the story of the Ford Calliope V8 takes its first significant turn, and it's a big one. Many people reference the June 1968 hot rod story as this engine's kind of public debut from behind the curtain, but that's really not the case. Sports Car Graphic in late 1967 ran a photo of the engine installed in a race car and gave many theretofore secret details about the Calliope engine, and this was nearly a full year before the hot rod story came out. Was the Calliope in a GT40? Actually, kind of, but not really. It was in a Can-Am car that was being built from a GT40. So, what happened to Le Mans? Remember, 1967 was barely a decade removed from the 1955 Le Mans disaster that killed dozens of people and had a huge negative effect on racing globally. Watching Fords, Ferraris, and now other companies bringing more horsepower, more aerodynamics, and more speeds way beyond 200 miles per hour on the straights, race organizers were getting more and more nervous about preserving the safety of the people at the event and not allowing another large-scale disaster to happen, which would effectively put it out of business. Now, that was the official line. What actual Ford fans will tell you is that the French officials didn't like the big block V8s beating their refined and, frankly, more European ideas. Either way, after the 67 race, they changed the rules. For starters, the class that the GT40 ran in was restricted to a 5-liter maximum displacement, and even the fuel tanks were regulated in size as well, restricting their range, of course, the larger the engine was going to be. All in all, this simply killed big blocks at Le Mans and ended the full factory support of Ford at that race. Now, that being said, John Wyeth would take cars, install small block Fords with gurney Westlake heads on them, and win the 1968 and 1969 versions of the race with GT40s that were comparatively ancient to the rest of the field. Yes, the incredible GT40 won the 24 Hours of Le Mans an astounding 4 times in a row with big blocks and small blocks. Okay, remember how I mentioned that Ford Total Performance was this global war in motorsports that was all about attacking and winning on every front? It was, except for one, the Can-Am. While Ford was concentrating on winning the Indy 500 and Le Mans, the Can-Am series, perhaps the most insane road racing circuit ever, wasn't just flourishing in North America, but it was exploding in popularity all over the country. Tiny open cockpit cars with thumping big block engines, the world's best drivers, and the world's fastest road racing machines. It was rock star level stuff by the 1967 season. Out of Le Mans, Ford needed in on this, and they knew they were all but done racing in France, but they also knew they had 2 GT40 Mark IV Spyders that weren't totally built yet. Those were sent to the famed Carcraft shop in Michigan with the orders that they be turned into open cockpit Can-Am racers and they'd be powered by the Calliope engine. As brilliantly cool as an idea as this sounds like it may be, it was not. In fact, it was the tipping-off point for the most disastrous racing foray Ford had in the entire Total Performance era. Can-Am cars were not hacked-up former sports cars. They were light, they were lithe, they were crafted from the ground up with every nut and bolt considered. Well, all of them were except for one called the Ford G7A. Now, I'm not being unnecessarily harsh in my assessment of this program, nor am I being unnecessarily harsh on those that worked on it. They were given their marching orders, a directive, and their brilliant minds did their best to defy physics, logic, and time. 1 out of 3 ain't bad. By the time the GT40 had been converted into what would be known as the G7A, they had a 1,900-pound car with a 640 horsepower engine that was going to try to race with cars that weighed 1,500 pounds and had 700 horsepower engines. You don't have to be Stephen Hawking to realize that ain't great math. Not to mention the fact that the 2 Calliope engines that had been built were the only 2 that existed. Now, there were castings for 3 more, but only 2 engines existed, and only they had ever been run on a dyno. The car used a 2-speed transmission with a torque converter. The transmission had been developed in the drag racing Ford Total Performance program run in funny cars, called a semi-automatic, as the driver did have to physically shift it. There were similarities to this unit and the one used by Jim Hall in his Chaparral cars during this era as well. The machine had 12-inch Kelsey Hayes brakes, 15x8 wheels up front, 15x12 wheels out back. The front suspension was unequal-length A-arms with Coney adjustable shocks, and out back there was a 4-link with inverted A-arms, a trailing link, an upper transverse link, and another pair of Kone adjustable shocks. Complicated? Kinda. Effective? Look, that's not to say that the machines did not appear absolutely awesome. Packing a 95-inch wheelbase, a track width of 59 inches up front, 55 out back, and an overall length of 159 inches, an overall width just shy of 72 inches, and a total height from the ground to the top of the roll bar of 34.5 inches, this car had 62% of its weight over the rear tires and was ready to get testing. The G7A had been wind tunnel tested, a couple of different noses were developed, you'll notice a round and square one in differing photos, and a huge dihedral wing had been added to the top of the car for downforce and stability at the insane speeds it would be reaching. With the Can-Am season starting in mid-September of 1967, their car hastily built, their engine unproven, the Ford team went to Stardust Raceway in Las Vegas in the late summer to test the car. It was a disaster. The fuel injection wasn't happy away from the dyno. The big wing that looked good in the wind tunnel was actually working against the car as it ran quicker without it. The engine was passing water into the oil, and by the time they quit, the car was 14 seconds. Not 1.4, but 14 seconds off the lap record at Stardust International Raceway. It was decided that the car would not appear at the 1967 Can-Am opener at Road America. Subsequent testing showed the car wouldn't actually show up to a single race in 1967. Now, about the water in the oil. At the time, engineers blamed it on porosity in the block castings. Is it possible that it was somehow working by those studs sealed with copper O-rings? Impossible to say now, but the porosity argument is as good as any in hindsight, especially because the blocks were made on a virtually experimental basis. Woefully unprepared for 1967, 1968 wasn't any better. The car never saw the track and was only tested with poor results. Before the end of that year, the two converted GT40s, cars known as J9 and J10, were sold to Charlie Agapoo, the legendary former chief mechanic for Shelby's racing team, someone who had been Ken Miles' crew chief at Le Mans, and a brilliant mechanical mind with the brains and racing experience and wherewithal to get these cars turned around and competitive. Buying the cars for a literal dollar from Ford, he and his brother Kerry took them back, and over the next few seasons, they tried with small and quiet doses of help from Ford to make any progress, and there was none to be had. Outside of a second-place finish with the machine in Japan, it was hopeless. Mario Andretti and others that drove the cars didn't have much bad to say about the chassis, but they just never had an engine that could do the job. They tried 427s, the Calliope for a short time at the beginning, even Boss 429 engines, and later all-aluminum 494 cubic inches of the Boss were stuffed into this car. The harder they worked, the more frustrating it was until even Charlie and his brother Kerry threw in the towel. One of the cars was kept intact, and incredibly, one of them was actually made back into a complete Mark IV GT40, and it was sold at auction not too long ago for more than $1 million. But what about the Calliope? Ford had constructed 2 complete engines in the 1967 timeframe and supposedly had castings for 3 more. For many years, people could recall seeing a display engine. Random photos would pop up, but there was no closure to the story. And before we move into the huge plot twist to end this story, understand that while it may seem like the Calliope is a bad engine or I'm painting it as one, I'm really not. This thing was a rushed development experiment to be run in a sports car. It was placed in a machine that could accelerate, brake, and turn harder than it was ever intended to live through. It proved that it was worthy on the dyno, and with more development work, it likely would have been worthy on the track too. These guys didn't miss much during the total performance era, and to blame the Calliope for being forced into battle with very little testing and training, I'm not putting that on the engine. Now, here's the best part. A small band of hardcore Ford enthusiasts is actually working to bring the Calliope back to life and in a production environment. Dan Schoeneck of Schoeneck Composites is one of the hardest core Ford people in the universe. This guy's managed to find, save, and generally collect some of the most rare items in the history of the brand, modern and otherwise. When he went on a quest for Calliope history, he did not fail. He and fellow Ford madcap genius Jay Brown actually got their hands on things like the cylinder head casting molds, the actual Ford blueprints for the engine, and more. They've already been working to reproduce the cylinder heads, And now by adding Greg Green of Chop Smitty to the group, they're actually modeling the engine block in 3D to produce. Not like 100 years from now, but in like the real-life future. You need to follow this project. I have no skin in this game other than being a gearhead and watching incredibly talented and motivated people do something that seems impossible. You got to follow these guys on Facebook. You can go to Chop Smitty's YouTube channel. He actually has a great video on the engine which talks about some of the different history and also goes into his modeling of this engine block, which is a massive project he's doing in cool 3D engineering modeling type of software. You can check out his YouTube channel. He does all kinds of cool machining stuff as well as, hot rod, race car stuff. He's built motorcycles. He's built hot rods. The guy's good, and he is a great guy to have as part of this team to bring this engine back to life. So that's the story of the Ford Calliope V8 for now. There's an incredible new chapter opening up on this one, and I can't wait to see it come to fruition. It was an engine that kind of got caught in the gears of history and never got its day in the sun. But perhaps 60 years later, dawn is just getting ready to break. I'm Brian Loans. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more history on engines, cars, and the things both mundane and extraordinary that make up the mechanical world around us. See you next time.